Hello, Ant Lab listeners, and welcome to an interview episode brought to you by the Arts Management and Technology Lab. My name is Alyssa, and I'm the podcast producer. In this episode, I, along with guest co-host André Solomon, sit down with Grace Stewart, the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Project Manager at the American Alliance of Museums. Together, we will discuss the Alliance's Facing Change initiative and how the project is addressing equity in museums across the nation. Please note that we are recording this episode as of April 10th, 2020, during the coronavirus pandemic. We are practicing social distancing by recording over Zoom. Therefore, you may hear differences in the audio quality, particularly as we switch from speaker to speaker. We hope you enjoy this episode, brought to you by AntLab. Okay, so I am here today with our guest, Grace Stewart, and our co-host, André Solomon. Could you take a moment to introduce yourselves to our listeners, starting with Grace?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Grace Stewart, and as you said, I am currently the DEAI, as we like to call it, project manager at the American Alliance of Museums. And my core job right now is to work on the Facing Change initiative. Previous to that, I was in Memphis for 7 years. I have worked at the Metal Museum there, as well as the National Civil Rights Museum.
So my name is André Solomon. I am also, as Alyssa is, a candidate for a Master of Arts Management here at Carnegie Mellon, and I'm a guest co-host today. For my studies, I'm really focusing on, again, DEI work as well, social justice advocacy, and cultural policy, really trying to advocate for people who aren't always at the table in arts.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much to the both of you for joining us today. So recently, we've had the pleasure of hosting Grace here at Carnegie Mellon at the Master of Arts Management Speaker Series to talk about the Facing Change initiative. According to the Alliance website, 77% of museum directors believe that expanding the racial and ethnic diversity of their boards is important to advancing their missions. Yet, 46%, or nearly half of boards, are 100% white, and only 10% of museum boards have developed a plan to become more inclusive. The Facing Changes initiative's goal, therefore, is to help leaders achieve their goals of diversifying their boards.
Also, the project currently has 51 museums selected from Chicago, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose area, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Jackson, and Minneapolis, St. Paul, for all the board diversity and inclusion program. In addition, 10 Facing Change Diversity Fellows were selected to act as coaches for the selected museums. Around $4 million in grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Alice L. Walton Foundation, and the Ford Foundation back this project. With this, the initiative will focus its efforts on leadership engagement and development. Plus, will offer an online resource center for inclusive museums, governance, and will have board matching support to connect individuals interested in serving on a museum board.
All right, so to kick off our discussion today, I'd like to first visit the idea that you, Grace, have brought up in the lecture that we are not conditioned to really talk about race. In fact, race is the top indicator of social inequities and disparities. And when we start discussing it, we start to feel uncomfortable and vulnerable. And when that happens, people start to ignore the topic altogether sometimes. So I'd like to ask you, Grace, how do we set expectations for leadership or for a board that in order to move a project on diversity forward, they're going to need to be vulnerable about the realities that we live in and start getting comfortable with talking about race?
Sure, that's a great place to start. I think one of the things that we've learned is that we probably could project when working with our boards. I think working with trustees is a particularly interesting group to work with because they're often in their daily lives leaders. They're often the voice of authority and are viewed as correct and having all the answers. So being in a space where they don't have all the answers or have to be really ready to make mistakes and to admit that they don't necessarily know everything, because none of us know everything about this work, is very challenging. And it takes a lot of relationship building on the front end to get everyone comfortable with that kind of work. Some of the things that we start off talking about really is when you are in a learning space. And that happens when you're outside of your comfort zone. So you can stay in your comfort zone and not grow, but you can step out of your comfort zone. And that's really where learning happens. And it's very hard to learn and grow if you're not willing to get uncomfortable. So we ask people to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And we define this as a difference between a safe space and a brave space. In safe spaces, you center your comfort. And in brave spaces, you push past that to get to that learning. We also want to set up kind of a container for that vulnerability. So we start out by setting expectations. Growth helps put people at ease and recognize that this is what's expected. We also try to demonstrate that. Even though we may be facilitating a conversation and we may have some areas of expertise, we try not to refer to ourselves as experts in this work because it's really hard to be an expert in this work. You can have a lot of experience to draw on, but we really don't know what equity looks like because it doesn't exist in our communities. And so we're all working towards an ideal, and that means that you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, and there's going to be a lot of learning, even for people that have been doing this work their whole lives. So really saying that up front, and sometimes giving examples of mistakes that we have made, and maybe recently, or areas that we've recognized about the journey. There's no end point. It's a constant learning. And I think setting up that expectation too allows people to be humble, to admit that there's going to be more places to learn, more things to do. And I think that helps them get a little bit more comfortable with that. We also try to establish some shared values in this space. This is very much values-based work. And so being able to get input from our participants about what are the things that you care about. You're here because this is important to you. We care about empathy. We care about, being learning, pushing ourselves. And I think setting that all up at the beginning gives us as facilitators, but it also gives the rest of the board and the participants that place to refer back to, because you're going to confront the beginning. Then it's easier when it shows up in the conversation to point back to it and say, we already agreed this. Let's not be judgmental of each other, since we all know we're all learning. And then you can address it a little bit moment when the uncomfortableness arises. Having that thing to refer back to is really, really helpful. So those are some of the things we talk about with our participants, and again, and recognizing that in these spaces with trustees, sometimes that.
Oh my goodness. I apologize once again, folks. I don't know like what happened there for a second. Zoom just actually like kicked me out very randomly. Yeah, Andre, if you're able to start over again, that would be a big help.
Yeah, no problems. In 2018, the Facing Change DEIA report was published, and it included 5 key insights. One of these insights is that systematic change is vital to long-term, genuine process. And among the recommendations for this insight is having organizations create a diversity plan. So what sorts of items would you recommend to be on an arts organization's diversity plan?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. I would start by saying that I think for us, there's a difference between a diverse, our museums to do is to move away from just focusing centering equity, and that's a little bit different. When we're counting diversity really is just numbers. It's just counting the difference that's in the room, and it's actually not necessarily the best indicator of inclusion or of equity. And we see that because we often see when museums and when any organization really brings on diverse, whether it's staff or board members, they often have retention problems. So they might be able to recruit diversity, but they have trouble keeping diversity. And that's really because they kind of stop the work at the numbers. And so what we want to do is shift past the numbers and start looking at outcomes. And so that's why we really want to center equity. DEI plans really is, we want the plan to be actionable. What we've seen in the field over the last 50 years is that a lot of institutions, particularly arts institutions, are like genuinely interested in being more representative and being more diverse, but a lot of their work has been aspirational and not actionable. And so what we really want is for any kind of plan to be actionable. And what that means is kind of moving beyond the statement. A lot of organizations might have some kind of diversity and inclusion statement that says something like, we at this museum really value this and it's important to us. And then that's kind of it. I think that's a good start. I think you should start there by saying your values, but we really want to move past that. I think one of the things that we encourage every plan to have is a space for shared language and setting your definitions. Because what we also see is that people get tripped up over the definitions. So we might say, we really value diversity and inclusion, but we don't define that. And so now we don't really know what we're measuring because everyone's coming to the table with different ideas about what that actually means. And so as specific as you can be for your institution about what is diversity for you. And that might change according to who your audience is, to what your geographic region is. There might be particular members or particular groups in your community that exist just in your area that don't necessarily apply to everyone. So I think being very specific and making sure that you have a shared language to move from. I think the other thing is having shared content, and shared understanding. And everyone, again, comes to this work at different places in their journey. And so if you're working as an organization or as a board on creating some kind of equity plan, making sure you build in opportunities for training so that everyone in your organization is going through training together, or at the very least, you have a task force that's going through the training together and able to then disseminate and share that information so that you are all coming to this work with the same understanding. And, there are lots of frameworks you can use for training, and pick one that works for you. That the reason there are a lot of them is because institutions and organizations are unique and not every single framework might fit the best. So find one that works for you and then apply it. And that way everyone's working from the same lens. And that's going to help you, I think, with whatever your plan is. Again, like we said, with having that kind of diversity and inclusion statement, starting with your values. And a lot of organizations already have value statements. If you don't, this is a good time to work on them or to relook at them if you already have them. We have a mission statement often, usually we have a vision statement. But I think having a list of values, what are the things that are important to your institution, and making sure that equity is included in that, and then including those values in your equity plan, I think is important because again, this work is grounded in values. And so kind of reiterating that from the beginning. We would also, one of the things I think to think about is when we're talking about making it actionable, that of course comes with some ideas around measurement. And, I know we are all very data driven here at CMU.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how you go about evaluating this.
Yes, absolutely. And so there are a couple things with metrics, and evaluation can be very tricky with this kind of work. What we've seen is, traditionally and quite frankly now, a lot of our metrics are around outputs, right? Because we're looking at diversity. How many people of color are on the board? We can measure that, and that could be an indicator of whether our plan is working. But again, if we're not looking at retention, right, then we might not really be getting at the heart of what we really want to do, which is create, an equitable situation where people are shared. And so we want to try and shift away from just measuring outputs. I think it's a good place to start, but we want to shift into measuring outcomes. And that's going to be, the outcomes may be different for different institutions. And so really thinking about, what are your goals? What are you wanting to see happen? What do you want to see change in your community? And finding ways to make sure your metrics are aligned with this is that these are long-term processes. So it's really hard to measure real outcomes in a short-term way. And I think especially when you're dealing with grants and projects and funders, they want to know at the end of each year, the progress that you've made. And so we then fall back onto our outputs because we can say, well, we had 100 people participate in the program and we have this many museums engaged and this many trustees, and they've brought on this many new, board members of color. And again, that shows something, but it doesn't really get at equity. And so I think we have to, even in our conversations with funders, start to explain why we need to measure outcomes, why we need community input. So often institutions are self-assessing, in your plan, opportunities to get feedback from your community. We're creating these plans for community engagement, for inclusion. And oftentimes that happens in a boardroom inside an institution with all the same people that haven't been able to figure this out before. And so seeking outside input, and whether that's through having community conversations or having your community review your plan before you publish it, getting input from them, and then having your community hold you accountable so that you're not going through your own checklist and being like, yeah, we did a great job. We did a great job here and there. And, are you really the best person to make that call about whether your, community outreach, your community engagement, your inclusion of your communities is happening, or is your community the best person and the best group to make that decision? So I think including that in there. The other thing I would add is to embed your plan across departments. So if you're creating a task force to work on this plan, make sure that that task force includes representation from different departments. This is not just your C-suite level folks. This is not just, if you're doing a board plan, then it's your board, but then you're looking at different committees. But if you're doing an organizational plan, it should include all departments. And, I think sometimes, especially in museums, we see a lot of our community engagement, our equity work centered in education, because they're the folks that are, most directly touching our communities, or we see it centered in curatorial work, in programming. But it needs to be centered everywhere. If your HR department is not included, if your accounting department is not included, if you're marketing for everybody, equity work is something dismantle some of our, white dominant culture that prevents inclusion is by looking at where it exists everywhere. And so it's important to have, representation from all different departments at the table, and then to embed the equity work into all those departments. When we talk about how equity works at museums and we start talking about accreditation and our standards, it's important to look at how we're equitable at all levels and according to all of those standards and best practices. If your collection at your museum is not equitable, if it's not diverse and inclusive, then your collection really isn't excellent. So if you all do, right? No one wants to go to work and be like, we'll be mediocre. If you want to be excellent, it has to happen everywhere. And so I think that that's another important part. Sometimes we create these diversity, inclusion, equity plans that exist completely in isolation, and they need to be integrated back into the organization in all ways. So those are some of the things I would think about right away to include in a plan. And that's a lot. And quite frankly, that's a lot of work. So I think also sometimes we want to just very quickly create something. And it's about being like, okay, we need an equity plan. Let's get together next week. We have a 2-hour meeting. And then by the week after, you'll have written it up. We'll do some edits. But like really doing a plan well, I mean, you're looking at 12 to 18 months. If you're getting community feedback, if you're getting engagement, if you're doing any kind of surveys of community engagement and who's included in order to have that reflected in your plan, you have to take the time to do it.
Yeah, and really you can see like the quality that comes from a diversity plan. Like if you take the time to really build it out and make it as effective and as excellent as possible. And something that I really wanted to quickly bring up within the Facing Change report that was published, the Alliance actually has a few definitions for diversity, inclusion, I believe accessibility and equity in there. Um, so I'm actually curious, like if museums or other arts organizations could use those as starting points, and then um, use these definitions like to shape what is best for their organization, like whether they are part of a museum or part of a theater or part of an orchestra.
Absolutely. I think it's a great place to start. For us, it was really important to set those definitions for us, so that as we're talking about our work, people know what we're talking about. Now, institutions may look at those definitions and say they might want to get a little bit more specific. If you're looking at community diversity, for example, I just came from Memphis not too long ago, and Memphis is 65% Black. So when we're talking about diversity, we're taking that into consideration. If we're looking at the Twin Cities, for example, they have a large Somali refugee community there. They need to take that into consideration. So diversity might mean something a little bit different if you start to get really specific about it. And I think being specific about it allows you to make sure that you're actually including your community. I heard from a museum, particularly from a group of artists in the community around this museum, that they were very frustrated. And it was a Latinx community that was saying, we really aren't represented in this museum. and we want to be represented. And so the museum's response was to bring in international Latinx artists, which was not actually what they wanted. They wanted people from their community to be represented. And if they are a Brazilian population and you're bringing in a Colombian artist, like that's still missing the mark. And so being really clear about who is your community, what is the diversity you want to represent, I think is important because it helps keep you on track.
Absolutely. So, as mentioned before, one of the goals for the Facing Change initiative is providing an online resource center for inclusive museum governments. This will have case studies, sample documents, and custom content for thousands of museums. And, I'm curious if you are able to talk about like this point of the project. Could you give us more information about this, including how it will be built and which platform it will be featured on?
Sure. So we are in process. So some of the work is happening and some of it's still a little bit aspirational. But one of the platforms we're using right now is ICO Here, which is a learning platform and an educational platform, kind of similar to Blackboard. And this is for the museums to move through the program. And so we are developing it now. We'll be launching it hopefully in the next couple of days. And that way it will give us central learning space for all the museums to be able to come, to be able to go through their trainings, to be able to download and share information with their trustees, to answer questions and engage with their fellows. And really that is to try and centralize how that program works. Because previously it was happening through like email and phone calls and spreadsheets and was just very, very cumbersome. And as we're looking at how to scale this program, having 50 museums go through the program is great. We have thousands and thousands of museums in the country. And so if we want to make real national change, trying to figure out how to scale something. And so being able to use technology to like centralize that learning is going to be really helpful. The other thing that I think is really interesting, center that does live on our website. And so that's part of the offerings that AAM has with our other resources. And so there's a section of our resource page that is dedicated to equity and inclusion and trustee resources. But the other thing that we're working on that I think is going to be, I think has the potential to be really impactful is a board matching portal. And so that would work. We've kind of been joking internally, it will be like Board Bumble, where you can have potential board candidates, someone that might be a really great diverse candidate on your board, get matched up with an institution that has like values and like interests, and that provides a skill that that institution's board might need, whether that's accounting or HR or community outreach. And so a lot of what we hear from boards and we hear internally within organizations as well is that they really want to be more diverse, but they just can't find anyone, right? That just doesn't exist. It's a pipeline issue. And what we found is that, actually there are lots of people that could join boards. They're just outside of the current network of the board. And usually board recruiting processes include, people sit around the room that are already on the board and offer up nominations of people they think would be great. And those are, of course, people that they know. And so if you in your personal network as a trustee is not particularly diverse, you aren't going to be able to offer diverse candidates. And because all of this is about relationship building, sometimes it's very challenging to move outside of your network. And that's a long-term process. So to facilitate that a little bit more quickly, the board matching portal would be a place where we actually have a ground team that we're working with some consultants on that go into the community and help to scout potential board members, people that would be interested, that have those needed skills. We would take them through a training so that they would learn specifically about museum governance, so nonprofit governance in general, and then what that looks like on a museum, so that they can then be matched with institutions in their area. And then we can create this kind of, almost like a dating site where people can come together. And so we're working on that platform now. So it's not quite ready to launch, but hopefully we'll be getting there soon. And we're looking at different ways that can work, and kind of, we're still figuring out some of those things. But I think it will have a lot of great potential because it will help build those relationships. And I think it's going to help move us past the pipeline issue And of course, the thing that we've previously talked about and that we are continuing to tell our boards is that getting diverse folks on the board is one part of the issue. Making them feel included, sharing power with them, examining your own culture so that you can recognize what barriers exist. That's really the hard work. And so that's what we're wanting our boards to focus on as we prepare this portal to help them recruit new potential board members.
Yeah, and I don't know, I know we're getting a little airing on time, but I kind of wanted to ask a little bit deeper with that and how, and again, if you don't want to answer this, but how in the terms of consulting, because for example, like to get diverse board participants and members is really great, but what are the expectations or the limits? Like, for example, are they people who are diverse and have a good amount of money that they can contribute to the board? Are they diverse but normal? Like, I feel like there's also like a subset of discrimination that could come about because of wealth or their own networks.
Yes, so those are all things that we are contending with. And what we're trying to do is to find diverse candidates across that spectrum, right? Like there are some museum boards who have very high give or get requirements because of the nature of their board. And some museums are examining that and making decisions about whether that in and of itself is a barrier and if there's anything they can do about it. And some are not there yet. And that's a requirement. They need that for their financial stability. And so what we want to do is provide enough candidates in that portal where there's a variety. Some museums, that's not as big of a deal, right? We have museums all the way from your large multi-million-dollar art museums to your smaller historic houses. And so the needs for each institution for their board members may vary. And so for some, the financial piece is not the primary piece. And we are encouraging people for it to not be the primary piece. We'll see how that goes. So I guess the short answer is that there will be people across the spectrum. Will there be some folks that we're calling kind of the Jackie Robinsons, the people that are ready to just go into whatever situation, they have the money to back them, and they'll be good, and they've been on boards before, maybe not that museum, maybe not a museum. Yes, there'll be some of those. There will also be people that have never served on a board before, but have been really engaged as activists in their communities and are going to be bringing a different skill set. And we're asking museums to right now to go through who's on their board and what skill sets are missing. Because what we don't want to do is just say, oh, look, here's a great Black person. They will go and be Black on your board. What we want to say instead is, oh, you need some more financial investment help. Here is a person of color who's a financial investor. Their skill set that they will be bringing to you is financial investment, and you will get in some cases, the bonus of having their perspective, which is also very, very needed on your board.
If you'd like to check out more of the American Alliance of Museums and the Facing Change Initiative, check out their website at www.aam-us.org. Thanks for listening to the Arts Management and Technology Lab podcast series. You can read more on the intersection between the arts and technology at www.amt-lab.org. Or you can listen to more interviews and discussions in our podcast series on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or Stitcher. Thank you for joining us.